Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the latest episode of the Stephen King podcast. This is a bonus podcast, and this is bonus episode number 34. And I have with me a returning guest. I think this is your third time, isn't it, Bruce?
It could very well be.
It could very well be. And the last time was April, and you were at that time you were promoting your latest book. If you want to mention now, you can go ahead and do that.
Timeless Trinity. It was the completion of the series of 3 books, so trilogy.
Okay.
So I called it Timeless Trinity, the paranormal experiences that I've had.
Right. And if listeners want to find out more about that, you can go back to the April episode, and Bruce talks about it in more detail there. But this time we're here. Bruce is going to be laying down some snark. He's going to get snarky with us. And I was waiting all day to say that, by the way.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. That's fine with me. That's
spelled. Your snark is spelled with a C and not a K. So we'll get into that.
But just as snarky.
Just as snarky. Okay, good. But just before we get into that, why don't you give everybody a brief overview of who you are and what you're all about and how you became a writer?
Sure. Yeah. I was born in Seattle, Washington in September 3rd, 1958 to Norwegian immigrant parents, and grew up with 2 languages, 2 cultures. And I ended up going into the Army, served 6 years in the U.S. Army, got out, worked at Boeing for a while, the big airplane manufacturer. And then the whole time I was getting my education, ended up with a PhD in history and teaching history. I've been teaching history at the college level for 30 years. I've been here in Southern California at Citrus College since 1998. And yeah, I've written plays, I've written books, short stories, and now comic books.
Cool.
So that's a brief.
All right. And this is not your first graphic novel. This is actually volume 2 of a series. And this is, as you mentioned, it's more of a graphic novel than a comic book. So
yeah.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about Snarc and where he came from and what's he all about?
Yeah. So this is Snarc number 2. The first Snarc number 1 was a traditional comic book, standard, 24 pages. Full color. This is 74 pages, so it's more of a graphic novel size. Also full color. Same artist, Gary Dumm, who has been an illustrator, professional comic book artist since the 70s. He worked for Harvey P. Carr on American Splendor. And some people may be familiar with the movie American Splendor from 2003, starring Paul Giamatti, among others.
Oh, yes. Okay.
That award-winning movie. But anyway, so Snarc started when I was, oddly enough, and I was working in a prison in West Germany in the Army. I was in a guard tower, and it came to me, this idea of an alien hybrid. And I was just kind of thinking about it, wrote down some things, but didn't really do anything with it. Didn't start writing any stories or anything. And then when I got out of the Army, the first time I was going to engineering school, Montana Tech, Butte, Montana. And I needed some extra credit, so I took a journalism course and worked on the school newspaper. And because I'm an artist and a writer, I said, hey, let me do a comic strip. And that's when I came, okay, now I'm going to use Snarc, right? This idea. So I fleshed it out and did 5 comic strips for the school newspaper. It was very popular. But then I flunked out of engineering school. So that was the end of that. And it didn't come back again. Snarc didn't come back again until January of 2019, when my son, my second eldest son, who is an engineer, so he did what his old man couldn't do. He made a bust of Snarc. He found one of the old comic strips, and he made a 3D bust with his 3D printer.
Oh, cool.
And then forged it in his forge, because he's got a forge at his home, and gave it to me as a late Christmas present. And,
nice.
And he inspired me. So then I said, that's it. I knew Gary Dumm. I was already working with him on other things, illustrations. So I said, Gary, I got to do Snarc. I got to do the comic. It's 37 years in the making. It's about time. And I just wanted to do a comic book. And so, so that's how it came to be. And it's really important to me. Comics are really important because that's how I learned how to read.
Okay.
I struggled to learn how to read, and I owe that to comic books. And I've collected comic books. In fact, I was just looking at some old comics today.
Okay.
So I've always been a comic book guy. and frustrated artist. And I just didn't trust myself to do a professional comic book illustrating it myself. That's why I enlisted the help of Gary Dumm, who knows all the ins and outs and has been doing this for a very long time. So that's kind of the genesis. And it also ties into the paranormal stuff too, because, a lot of time, even though the Snarc story is fictional, there are bits and pieces of my own life and paranormal stuff in there. So as my friend David Wilson, a Vietnam War veteran and writer, always told me, he says, fiction is more true than nonfiction anyway.
Cool. Okay. So what exactly is Snarc?
Snarc is, he's an alien hybrid. He's part human, part reptilian alien. And he comes to Earth with a mission, and his mission is to help prepare Earth for colonization by the reptilian aliens who are on the planet Maron, not moron, but Maron. And so he's sent, and he's got a sidekick, Cosmic Staff, who's this very snarky, this is where it comes in, a very snarky talking stick.
Okay.
And we don't really understand where he comes from, but anyway, he's just constantly complaining, and he wants to have a good time, and Snarc is getting in the way of him having a good time.
Right.
He really idolizes the Rat Pack, so he talks like that. And so that's the comedy relief. Snarc's kind of the straight man. And they have these adventures on Earth, trying to find out what's going on. And they learn, what Snarc learns is that he really likes humans. He is part human. So he decides that he's not going to prepare them for colonization, and he's going to have to give the bad news to the Empress back on the planet Maron, which causes all kinds of problems. But meanwhile, he has adventures on Earth, learns about who we are, learns to really love us, and wants to protect us.
Okay.
So that's the basis for the story. And Snarc II goes further into the background of Snarc, how he came to be.
I was just going to ask
he had
that.
a human mother and an alien father, and who the Cosmic Staff really is, his real identity, which is kind of interesting. And so anyway, and then they try to prevent this invasion, and it begins anyway, but we don't know how it ends. So that's I don't want to give too much away.
Okay.
But that's kind of the premise of the thing. And they get an ally or two along the way. A professor in Cleveland, who's an anthropology professor, decides to help them in their, because she studies ancient aliens. So she decides to help them, and her name is Dr. Jekyll, Henna Jekyll. Okay. Which is, this is a little known secret, but your listeners will be let in. Nobody knows this, but Henna Jekyll is an anagram for J. Allen Hynek.
Oh, okay.
And those familiar with UFO studies, he was the scientist behind Project Blue Book. So I love anagrams. So I did an anagram, and her name is Anna Jekyll. Or Henna Jekyll.
Right.
And so anyway, so now your listeners are the first to know that little secret.
Oh, cool.
When they read Snarc II.
All right.
But I don't mention it in Snarc II, so that's kind of a hidden Easter egg kind of thing.
Okay.
But yeah, so then she joins the team, and I've actually written her own comic book. I have it ready to go for Gary to illustrate whenever he finds the time, because he can't just work for me full-time illustrating my stuff.
Right.
He's got other jobs. So
sure.
That'll probably come out next year, and then there'll be a Snarc III and so forth and so on. But the cool thing about Snarc is that it's for all ages. A kid could read it and get enjoyment out of it. It's PG or G, whatever, rated.
Right.
An adult could read it and read it in a different way, and based on their life experience. So in that way, the model I had for that approach was the Rocky and Bullwinkle show that I loved when I was a kid, which when you watch it as a kid, it's very funny and goofy and you like it. And then you watch it as an adult and you go, wow, that's some adult humor there hidden, carefully packaged.
Right.
And so that's what I'm doing with, not saying it's as good as Rocky and Bullwinkle, but it's emulating that style.
That's a difficult balancing act of writing to do. I mean, I think Pixar Studios probably does it the best.
They do.
And if you're trying to emulate that, that's pretty impressive.
But I really wanted to reach children too, because the comic Snarc incorporates history, because I'm a history professor. So he goes to historical sites and there's historical information in there. Social issues, but not in a pedantic way. There's no preaching or anything. It's through the eyes of an innocent alien trying to help us.
Okay.
Trying to understand what goofy stuff we're doing here on Earth. And then there's also science fiction and fantasy and a lot of humor.
Mm-hmm.
I love, and the cosmic staff does most of the humor. Because he's just, constantly complaining. He wants to go to Vegas or Atlantic City or hang out with his Rat Pack kind of buddies.
That's pretty cool. So you mentioned that in this issue, we get into the backstory of Snarc, how he came to be, because half-breeds characters are, obviously Last of the Mohicans, Spock from Star Trek.
Yes.
So those kind of characters they're always very dramatically rich because they have one foot in both worlds. So it's interesting that you've chosen this path for this character. Does this character Snarc, or the staff is Snarc, right?
The cosmic staff is his sidekick. Yeah, he carries this thing that looks like a stick that has a face on it that looks a lot like Snarc. Okay. But it's not Snarc. It's another person that you'll find out when you read Snark II. But so obviously very, they are connected in some way.
Right. And does Snarc have any special abilities like can he levitate, or is he telepathic or anything like that?
Yeah, he has a lot of special abilities. Well, one thing they can do is travel through time and space through a interdimensional vortex, so they can get anywhere they need to go, usually unless there's some kind of interference going on. So they can do that. He also, with the help of the cosmic staff, cause people to be confused if need be. And if you have an enemy that's wanting to hurt you, you can cause kind of like the Jedi mind trick, that kind of thing. Okay. So he has some of that kind of stuff. But he's not like a superhero. He's actually kind of a little bit dorky in a way, because he doesn't understand everything, and the cosmic staff is always correcting him. And so he's not a perfect kind of superhero kind of character. But he does have abilities that come in very, very handy. Okay. Situations.
Is he cold or warm-blooded?
He is. I've never been asked that question. I would say somewhere in between, because he definitely has a more human look than he has the reptilian look. And of course, when he was growing up, that was quite difficult for him. Okay. Because the reptilians would tease him mercilessly. Other young ones.
Okay, I was just going to ask that. He grew up on the other planet,
Moron.
On
Moron.
Maron?
Yeah.
Maron?
Not to be confused with Moron.
Okay. Right. You might want to change that. I don't know.
I'm waiting to see how people pronounce it and I'll see what happens.
Okay. Yeah, I have to see it in print. It's because I'm kind of bleeding into Moron because you made that joke already.
I led you in the wrong direction. Yeah.
You did. So did you mention that it sounded like this was a cliffhanger? Well, the story's not resolved at the end of this issue?
In fact, at the end, it's kind of, you see the cover of Snark II, will this be Earth's future? And it shows, this Statue of Liberty, an homage to Planet of the Apes, which I loved when I was a kid, Oh, okay. So an homage to that. And then the cosmic staff is kind of broken and bent, and the reptilian security chief Ra is attacking them, and there's a very weak force field around Snarc and the cosmic staff. So, and it looks like there's a scorched earth thing going on, and so it's kind of a cliffhanger. We don't know. At the very end, they're trying to save the Earth from this invasion because Snarc doesn't carry out his mission. There are more bellicose members of the reptilians who go ahead and take that upon themselves. Right. I don't want to give too much away how they do it, but it's going to be very timely, which is kind of weird because I envisioned this story before all this stuff was been going on the last year. So it's going to be kind of freaky. It is kind of freaky. So. Oh, okay. I'll have to hold that thought for a minute then. I'll get back to you on that. That's a hint, though. It's a hint.
Yes. I just want to clarify, because you mentioned time travel. Is Snarc the only character that can time travel, or can all the aliens time travel as well? Yeah, the reptilians can, and of course the cosmic staff. Okay. And so they have that ability, but it's not that, there are difficulties like
And it kind of explains this whole idea of using some type of spacecraft versus not.
Okay.
And at one point, I think they mentioned that interdimensional travel without a spacecraft is very painful. I think they mentioned that one time. So I'm trying to, because people always say that, why do they need spacecraft if they can, travel in time or whatever, or through vast, distances. And the idea is that, well, you can, but it's, it's rather painful.
Okay. And your time travel rules, because time travel stories can be very tricky in that if you can constantly reset a timeline, then there's really no stakes. I'm thinking of, obviously, if you kind of think of like Lost with the flash forwards and that, flashbacks, but or the time tunnel. So if your characters can reset time all the time, what kind of rules do you have in place? Is every change create a new reality, or is it a loop, or is it a Mobius strip, or like how do you
they don't,
how you plan to handle that?
Yeah, they don't. I don't go into great detail about it, but yet anyway. But the idea is that they're more observers, and so they don't interfere. They're like in I don't know what you'd say, probably like a more of a holographic type thing.
Okay. Oh, okay.
But they can visit. Like for instance, they met a couple at an Area 51. I think this is in the first Snarc. And while they're talking to this couple, they realize that they're very sad and they had lost their son to opioid addiction. So they are able to not really travel in time, but to travel into another dimension so they can meet their son who's passed away in the spirit world where time is immaterial, right? So it's like, then it doesn't matter. So they're able to talk to their son. So this is the kind of stuff that Snarc and the cosmic staff can do. They can't, go back and then make it so that couple's young son did not die of an overdose. They can't do that. They can just connect to him in the other world. And so it's less of a classic time travel thing than it is just to look at the fluidity of, the theory here's my theory behind it.
Okay.
The spirit world, the alien world, and the quantum world are all really the same thing. Okay. So, but you cannot affect outcomes, at least in this particular version of reality that we're living in. Okay. Now, I don't get into, multiple universes and all that stuff, which could come later. You don't want to increase the complexity right away too much. Right. But I understand what you're saying. And yeah, it can be very tricky. Yeah, you have to be careful. So otherwise, what's the threat? Exactly. If they can travel in time, why do they have to worry about the reptilians invading? You can just go back and change things and whatever. Exactly. But that's not the way it is. Yeah. And of course, there's the grandfather paradox, where if you go back in time and kill your grandfather, how would you ever be born? Exactly. So how could you go back in the first place? Blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So time travel is interesting, but it's a very tricky thing to navigate, and the rules have to be pretty solid, and you can't break them, of course, because readers will just, cry foul. Yeah. But it sounds like you've gotten around it by making it more of a metaphysical, spiritual experience. Yeah, that's my whole point, is that, and then in reality too, this idea of aliens and UFOs, I think it is a much more spiritual thing than a nuts and bolts kind of thing. Right. And I guess that's kind of what Whitley Strieber does too. Yep. In his conceptualization. Right. So that's very much what I have experienced. Okay. That it's very much a spiritual thing. All right, cool. Or philosophical, type. Right. Okay, so let's circle back to your hint of a couple of minutes ago and paralleling modern times where we were all in lockdown. And even though seems to be a light at the end of the tunnel because vaccines are out there, but in the time period before that, like last year specifically, how did those events influence the Snarc number 2 issue? And how did you deal with that yourself? And was Snarc your way of dealing with it? Yeah, so I knew that the reptilians were a problem. We know in the first one. Okay. But how they were going to try to make it easier for them to colonize the earth, and for what reason, and it just conveniently fit in. And I had this idea before the pandemic that there was something along those lines, although not biological, if that makes sense. So I don't know if you remember the book by Kurt Vonnegut, where and I guess it's almost politically incorrect to talk about it, but the book where he said, God, what was the name of that book? Where the Chinese government had miniaturized people to a point where they could become like viruses.
Okay.
And then invade the United States, not as an invading army, but as a virus.
Is that Cat's Cradle?
No, it wasn't Cat's Cradle. What was it? It was one of his later works.
Okay. I
just can't remember. But anyway, I love Kurt Vonnegut. So
sure. Yep.
But so I think that was kind of in the back of my mind. So that now you have a really big hint about how the reptilians are approaching this whole situation. But the thing is that I conceived of that before, COVID became the problem that it is. So it's kind of interesting how life imitates art. And I'm not saying that I predicted it necessarily, although the paranormal stuff is interesting, how it feeds in, because I get a year before the outbreak of COVID, when I do these spirit walks, I was told that there were going to be a series of calamities.
Right. I remember that. Yep.
Yeah. And this is it. This is one of the big ones. Of course, then the economic calamity that goes along with it, and, natural disasters and all this other stuff. So it's funny when you're writing the muse or the to other world connection helps you steer in a way that you're not even aware of at the time.
Right.
And then it just comes out that way. So anyway, that's the, without giving away too much that's a lot of hints right there, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm dancing all around it, but
yeah.
I know where I'm getting.
Yeah. I think our listeners do too, but we'll be coy and just leave it at that. But that's cool. And so it really sounded like for you, the real world events really shaped your story, or did you have this story in a different form before last year and now it changed because of what happened last year?
I kind of knew where it was going to go. And it does. Obviously, events do influence the story. And in this case, I think the story influenced events in some way. I don't know how, but I think that, because I was told a year before all this started that there were going to be a series of calamities, I was already thinking that way, that how can this, what would be a plausible scenario?
Right.
And because I'm a historian, one of the things I've always talked about is when I talk about World War I is the impact of the Spanish flu.
Right.
And for years, I've been telling my students, that pandemics come and go.
Right.
There's cycles. And if we haven't had one in a long time, nature doesn't play around.
Yep.
Nature doesn't care.
Yeah.
And there's going to be another one. And people are saying, oh, there won't be anything as bad as the Spanish flu. And then, of course, it did happen. So that's not so much prediction as it just is preparation.
Right.
If you study history enough, you see that there's cycles, cycles of war, cycles in politics.
Right.
That's the other thing I said is every 40 years, we have a political shift in America. And the 2020 election was the end of the 40-year cycle that started in 1980 with Ronald Reagan. And before that, it was Franklin Roosevelt with the New Deal era that kind of lasted till Reagan came along.
Right.
And so now we got another one, which is moving the political center probably to the left. It looks like to the left. It had been moved to the right by Reagan. And I don't know if it's going to be exactly like the New Deal era or if it'll be more liberal, but it's definitely left of center.
Yep.
And we'll see how that plays out. And usually it lasts for about 40 years.
Okay.
Which is interesting. So that all that stuff informs me when I'm writing and plotting things out. But I do follow the muse. I follow the signal line and that intuition that tells you where the story should go. And sometimes it really is timely.
Okay. So the writing process for a graphic novel, is it substantially different than writing for a book? I know right off the bat that you're much more constrained in obviously the number of words that you can put into a graphic novel. So you have to be very precise and condensed in what you're conveying within a panel. And do you work concurrently with the artist, or how do you graph it out? I guess you maybe just storyboard it or something and then take it from there?
Yeah. Well, it's closer to what people probably do in a film with storyboarding because you have certain scenes that you want to capture.
Right.
A look or a design element. And because I am an artist too, obviously not on the caliber of Gary Dunn, I'll give him rough, what I call mock-ups of the pages.
Okay.
And then with all the story, and then he does the actual artwork, and he often changes the panels to make them look better or reorganizes them. Sometimes the story gets a little bit longer because he has things he wants to convey graphically that I didn't think of,
right? Or
he wants to modify something I did, because he's the master at sequential art. I understand the concept, so I'm not like giving him stick figures. I've drawn stuff. But sometimes I'll use like pictures from magazines and stuff, and I'll throw in there and write dialogue on it, But yeah, you're right. It's a different kind of writing. It's much more sparse than other kinds of writing, closer to what you do with a screenplay.
Yes. And
the picture does a lot. I mean, as Harvey Pekar said, you can do anything with words and pictures.
Yeah.
And that's why comics are so wonderful. And you can't be redundant. If you see a picture of Snarc in his spacecraft, you can't say Snarc is in his spacecraft.
Yeah.
Traveling through you can obviously see that, right?
Yes.
So you don't want to do that. So instead, I'll have stuff like they'll see Snarc in the spacecraft, and then there'll be some dialogue from the cosmic staff complaining about his driving, how terrible driver he is or something. That kind of stuff is more fun. So you can add the humor into it without having all this exposition.
Right.
The pictures, the wonderful illustrations provide all the context you need, and then you're actually more free to do interesting things, I think.
Right. So you said you storyboarded it out, but do you work from an outline or something? Like, because you must have story beats that you have to hit, and you must capture those. I'm
not that. The way I think is very fluid and organic.
Okay.
And as I sit down to draw, I'll take a piece of paper and I'll say, okay, this is where I think it should start. And I'll draw a little picture. And this is what he should say. And this is where it's going to go. And I don't plan the whole thing out for each story.
Okay.
And by the way, it's kind of different because Snarc is really a series of stories. Each part is about 4 or 5 pages, which is short. And each one has a theme. Each one has a moral, to it.
Okay.
So they're compartmentalized. So I think that helps, especially for younger readers, when they can stay in tune for 3 or 4 or 5 pages.
Right.
And for older readers, I think it's fine too, because you provide enough context and stuff between the lines, the subtext that they get it. And then it feeds in to the next story. It's not like they're all independent.
Right.
The next one leads, the adventures sometimes refers back to previous adventures.
Right.
So that's just the way it came out. That's the way my brain kind of works.
Okay.
In telling the story, rather than, most comic books, they draw it out. The whole comic is one story.
Right.
And I didn't do it that way. And I think there's a certain, that's just, that is the way. I want to use the word elegance, but I'm not sure that's the right word. But
right.
It just captures how I want to tell this story. And there is a narrative line, obviously, but it helps me to cover more places. Like as a historian, I like him to go to historical sites. Like he'll end up at Gettysburg.
Okay.
He was at Devil's Tower. That brings up the Native American story.
Right.
And just a story behind a story behind a story. He goes up into Alaska, or it could even be northern Canada. It's not, I'm kind of coy about where it's at.
Okay.
And meets the Inuit people. I think in Canada, they're Inuit. In Alaska, they're Inupiat. But anyway, what they used to call Eskimos.
Right.
And so there's a story up there about global warming.
Okay.
But it's not a pedantic, oh, shame on us for global warming. It's like he meets people up there and they tell him what they're going through, and Snarc helps in some way and in his little way.
Okay.
So it's all these things I'm very interested in. And I want him to be involved and learn a lesson from the humans that he talks to and interacts with.
Right. And you say there's a running narrative through the series. Like is he on a quest, or does he have some sort of goal, or is he just like a...
Yes, he has his whole idea is if his mission is obviously not going to work, because he realizes how much he gets taken home very abruptly back to Maron. And is told, you're failing in your mission. And he tries to argue that they are worthy of being saved. They shouldn't be colonized. Maybe we can learn how to work together.
Okay.
So that's kind of, he's heading towards that.
Okay.
which is not what the rulers want.
Right.
They want just a brutal regime to be established, and humans to be enslaved. So he obviously doesn't agree with that. So that is running through the whole thing. How do I get people to understand without being out like a lunatic? Like, in fact, he ends up in the White House in one of the episodes trying to explain what's going on.
Cool.
He meets Neil deGrasse Tyson, and at the studio, they pop in there.
Cool.
And that's an homage to the original Snarc when it was a comic strip where the original Snarc met with Carl Sagan. So,
right.
And he shows up, the ghost of Carl Sagan shows up. So anyway, I have so much fun.
Yeah, it sounds like
with this thing. I can go. So yeah, he ends up bouncing around these different places, but it's all carrying through the story, trying to enlist help to try to prepare us for the threat from his home planet.
Right. Right.
And so they take it seriously. And of course, as you know, like from the old show Time Tunnel, if you are going to try to change something in the past, people are going to think you're a lunatic. If you go back, I think there's one episode where they show up on the Titanic, and they're trying, hey, steer, watch out for the icebergs. Yeah. And the people think you're nuts.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I remember that show. Yeah, the Titanic, and then there's quite a few like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so at this juncture, you've got one issue out. It was out last year, I believe. Mm-hmm. This one is coming out. Is it available now, or is it still on the schedule?
Yeah, actually, Snarc 1 came out, I think, in November of 2019, and then Snarc 2 just came out, both as an ebook and as a print book through Amazon. And that was a whole other thing. I decided to go through Amazon rather than independently printing it myself, which I did for Snarc 1. So that's why I have 3,000 comics in my garage, which does not make my wife happy. Yeah. There's boxes and boxes of them in there. So although they'll be really valuable one day, collector's items. But for now, they're sitting there in our garage. So I told her, okay, I won't do that. So I had to find a different way. And I didn't have to do the Kickstarter thing.
How'd you find that Amazon process?
It's frustrating. And they take a substantial cut, but you can't beat their distribution system.
That's right.
It's ease for people to get a hold of it. Now, if somebody wants Snarc 1, a physical copy, they have to email me and that kind of stuff. And they PayPal me and then I send it to them. So it's not exactly as easy as Amazon Prime.
Right. Okay. So how many issues do you envision for this series to take, or is you going to let it run as long as you can, or? Yeah,
I don't, that's a good question. I don't really know. I do know that the Dr. Jekyll comic book will come out before Snarc 3, and it's a prequel to Snarc.
Okay.
So I thought that would be appropriate because she is an interesting character in her own right. Mm-hmm. And, I introduce her in Snarc 2, and then she'll have her own comic book prequel to meeting Snarc.
And does her last name hint at something that we know from another story, or the more famous story?
Like I said, I did an anagram of J. Allen Hynek. So, and it's interesting when you do anagrams, what you come up with that makes sense. It's not like some weird name. It's like, well, there was somebody named Dr. Jekyll, right?
Exactly.
So yes, and that hasn't been fully fleshed out yet, at least. Even though I've written the Dr. Jekyll comic book, which will be also a graphic novel size, so longer than a comic.
All right.
So more than likely it'll go the Amazon route because, like I said, it's limited space in our garage.
Right. Okay. How many pages is your Snarc 2?
74.
74.
Yeah.
All right.
Full color.
It's available.
Full color.
Yeah. Full color.
Full color. Yeah. Full. Yeah. It's really wonderful. Gary Dumm's wife, she's an artist in her own right, and she's very good colorist.
Okay.
So she did the color and the lettering. And,
all right.
And we have an editor, George Varongos from Seattle, who great editor and fanboy of Gary Dumm. So I didn't have to twist his elbow to be on the project because he loved Gary Dumm's art. So.
That's cool. Very good. And so you've got the Snarc 2 out. You're working on Dr. Jekyll. And what else are you working on right now?
I have another paranormal book coming out that focuses on a particular character entity that I contact when I do my spirit walks named Anzar. Mm-hmm. And he is an ancient alien mystic, believe it or not. And I've been in contact with him for almost 2 years, maybe longer than 2 years, 2.5 years. And I keep a daily journal of when I do make contact with him, when I record my walking meditations, spirit walks,
Right.
and then I transcribe it. So I have like 300 pages of journaling from all these walks that I've taken, and I'm turning that into a book and in the process of it, and it'll be out this year.
Okay.
And it's simply called Anzar. So it's going to be,
cool.
I think it'll be pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. All right. And if people want more background on Anzar, I'll refer you back to the previous podcast that Bruce did, and I'll put the link to that episode in the show notes. Yeah,
and he's already involved in the last two of the trilogy, both Timeless Trinity and also Timeless Deja Vu. I think Anzar's in Timeless Deja Vu too, just hinting at him, and then a little bit more in Timeless Trinity. So now he's going to have his own book.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
All right. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about, Snarc related, or anything else?
No, just that that Snarc's catchphrase is "Be the light." Be the light. As a catchphrase, and it actually makes sense from a metaphysical standpoint, because they think that DNA, our DNA, has a ability to fluoresce, so it emits light. So they think that light emission is part of what might explain telepathy and telekinesis and instant communication, like between two loved ones halfway across the world, how they know each other, if one's in danger, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Or twins, that kind of stuff.
Right.
So the light thing is pretty important to that whole concept. So really it all ties together, I guess. Right. If you think about it, Lou, everything I'm doing kind of ties together.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's cool. Yeah, well, everybody's doing a shared universe nowadays, so you might as well join the crowd.
Sure, there you go.
All right, well, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Bruce. Guess we'll be talking maybe later this year when your next book comes out.
Sure.
If not, all the best to you. And as usual, you always have some very fascinating stories and ideas to talk about.
Well, thank you, Lou. I appreciate it very much.
You're most welcome. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Take care. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.